In its really authentic form, or forms, because it can take many different forms, but spirituality is really the calling from something very, very deep within us. It's a calling from part of our being, or the greater part of our being, which is actually trying to find its way through all the intricate layers of complication that the sort of egoic mind seems to be constantly creating. And one of the challenges of spirituality is to kind of keep connected with the root of it, with its point of origination inside of you. The reason that becomes so important is so that the spiritual impulse itself doesn't get sort of hijacked by all the agendas of sort of the conflicted self, really, which often reaches out for quick answers and temporary fixes and temporary satisfactions, and often just kind of skims upon the surface of our experience. You know, the conflicted self is really, even though it can feel like it has very deep roots sometimes within you, it actually is a very surface part of our experience. It's a particularly compelling part of experience because it's so, you know, the more confused something is, the more divided it is, the more compelling it is. It almost has a sort of psychological gravitational force to it. Conflict and certainly our sort of personal dramas, you know, they have this sort of gravitational force which keeps just pulling attention in almost a very impersonal way, in the same way that the gravity that holds all of our bodies to the earth is an impersonal force. And the conflicted self is it produces so much angst in all these various forms. And this whole world of angst that it creates is very sort of dramatic, you know? And has a very dense kind of gravitational pull. And that's one of the things that anybody is actually, in a certain sense, competing with for attention. Because our attention is really our most prized commodity that we have. It's the most important aspect of us is our attention, and what we're doing with our attention and where we're putting our attention. And in spirituality, in one manner of speaking, is the act, or a kind of conscious use of our attention, a conscious use of our consciousness, a conscious use of our awareness. In other words, what are we doing with this most basic and most fundamental aspect of our being, which is our awareness, our consciousness? What are we doing with it? Where are we putting it? Where is it abiding? Where is our intention around our attention? And this is really, in many ways, this is the heart of many spiritual practices. It's kind of, what am I doing with my consciousness? What am I doing with my awareness? What am I doing with my attention? It is something that so often people don't even think about. They don't even consider. It's part of the density of the gravitational force of the conflicted self or the false self. It's sort of this dense gravitational force to where, you can go through all of life simply trying to solve one internal state of sorrow, one disaster after another, and it just seems to never end. In fact, if our attention remains captive to that dimension of experience, then it is endless. It's endless because it's cyclic. You deal with one thing only to deal with the next thing and the next thing and the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, and it just has this sort of cyclic, endless nature. I suppose that's why the Buddha referred to it as the wheel of samsara, this sort of cyclic turning of a wheel. It doesn't really have it's not a straight line. It doesn't actually arrive at a destination. The wheel of samsara, the wheel of, which is really the wheel of a kind of needless suffering. That if our attention is held captive by this cyclic movement of internal conflict, it remains held captive, and the cyclic nature of it just keeps going, and it goes and goes and goes and goes and goes. Often, not always, but often people kind of come to a real authentic spirituality when, they may have worked on themselves for a long period of time or a short period of time, and they start to get on to the fact that even though a kind of working on oneself can be a perfectly legitimate and at times very necessary thing to do, that if our attention stays solely within that domain, then there's always the next thing, and there's always the next thing, and in other words, we're always working and working and working and working and working on arriving somewhere, all the time supposing that if we work on ourselves enough, we'll get to this place where we won't have to work on ourselves anymore. And a lot of times people that have done a lot of that work, a lot of times their real deep spiritual life starts when they worked on themselves to a certain extent, and they start to see the cyclic nature of it. Although it can have some important effects. In other words, it can relieve a certain amount of sorrow and angst and suffering, but there always seems to be sort of the next layer and 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 the next layer. And so even though that kind of work can be very important at a certain point, if we have all of our attention occupied in that domain of human existence, then it very much we start to realize at a certain point that it's cyclic. It just kind of keeps going. There's always the next thing about oneself to improve upon. And so there's sort of this point of balance in a manner of speaking. But before I get to that, I'll just mention that when we start to realize this sort of cyclic nature, just the recognition of it, having lived through it enough, the recognition of it can start to free up attention. When we start to wonder, is there something more than this endless project, than turning myself into an endless project, into an endless project of improvement? As I said, the balance point, in a sense, is even though that can be important and provide usefulness in life to a certain point, they're also simultaneously comes with it a kind of recognition that it does have a quality to it that's endless. There does have a quality to it that has a sort of familiar repetitive feeling to it. And that's when consciousness, that's when our attention starts to become available to something else. That's when our attention becomes available to dive into something inside of ourselves that's much deeper than all that.